You smiled when you didn't want to. Not because you were pretending, not because you wanted to deceive anyone, but because something in you believed that your discomfort should never become someone else's burden. From such a young age, you learnt to read the room before you read yourself. You noticed when someone was on edge, and your instinct wasn't to protect yourself, it was to soften the moment for them. That's how it started, didn't it? That slow training of your face to carry peace, even when your heart had none. The smile wasn't always joyful. Sometimes it was trembling, barely holding up, but still it was there, stitched into every gathering, every moment someone might notice you. Every question where I'm okay was easier than the truth, and with time it became automatic, like a reflex, like armor, a way to keep things light, to avoid that heavy pause after honesty. You didn't want their pity, you didn't want their discomfort, and so you smiled again and again, even when you were unraveling. There were days your whole world felt like it was tilting, when your chest was tight, your thoughts too loud, your eyes too dry from holding it all back. But still, when someone looked your way, you made sure your expression didn't ask for anything. Maybe they called you strong, maybe they thought you were the cheerful one, but they didn't see how hard it was, how much effort went into looking like peace. Sometimes when you were alone, your face felt sore, like your muscles were tired of pretending. You'd sit quietly, feeling the emptiness echo back at you, and wonder how no one had noticed. How could they not see the shift in your eyes, the difference in your voice, the way your laugh had more air than joy? But the truth is, most people don't look that closely, especially when you're so good at making sure they don't have to. You became the safe one, the easy one, the one they could vent to, lean on, ask favors from, because you made them feel good, you made them feel lighter, and part of you liked that. Part of you found purpose in that, but another part, the part you ignored, was drowning. It whispered late at night, "What about me?" But you told it to be quiet. There were more important things, always more important things than your pain. You started to feel like a background character in your own life, like your emotions had to take a seat in the hallway, while you entertained the emotions of everyone else. You mastered the art of being fine, of changing the subject when it got too close, of laughing at your own hurt before anyone else could take it seriously. Because if you laughed first, then maybe it didn't count, maybe it didn't matter. And then there were those moments, quiet, aching moments, when someone would actually ask, really ask, "How are you really?" And you'd freeze, because you didn't know how to answer anymore. You'd forgotten how to speak that language. You'd smile again, the same worn-out smile, and say something like, "I'm just tired," and they'd nod, satisfied, not realizing how close tired was to barely holding on. There's a kind of grief that comes with being unseen, not invisible in body, but invisible in need. You're there, always there, but no one thinks to ask what it's costing you, because you never make it obvious. You carry your pain like it's your fault, like it would be selfish to set it down, and so you keep showing up, keep smiling, keep nodding through the weight of it all. And every once in a while, something cracks. Maybe you snap at someone, maybe you cancel plans, maybe you cry without knowing why, and then the guilt floods in, not just for feeling bad, but for showing it, for slipping, for being too human, for reminding people that you're not made of sunshine and patience all the time, that you're not made of steel, that you too have a limit. It's exhausting, isn't it? Carrying all that silence behind your smile, wondering if people love the real you, or just the version of you that doesn't need anything back, the version that listens more than speaks, gives more than receives, smiles more than feels, and even when someone says, "You can talk to me," you hesitate, Because experience has taught you that not everyone means it, that some doors are open only as long as you're easy to handle, so you return to your default. Polite, helpful, composed, and somewhere in there, the real you folds a little further inward, not gone, just quieter, just waiting. Waiting for a space where your truth won't feel like too much, where your sadness won't be an inconvenience, where your smile won't be required to make others feel safe. And maybe you're wondering if that place even exists, if it's even allowed to be the one who needs comfort, to be the one who falls apart, to be the one who doesn't smile when it hurts. But for now you keep smiling, not because you're okay, but because that's what you've always done. There were days when your smile felt like the only thing holding the room together. Even when your hands were shaking, or your heart was heavy, you wore it like a uniform, not because you wanted to, but because you felt like you had to, like it was expected of you, like not smiling would somehow let the world down. So you kept doing it, at school, at home, in every photo, in every group. You were the calm one, the light one, the stable one, and sometimes even you started to believe it. But late at night, when the world got quiet and no one was looking, that mask would slip just enough for the pain to breathe, and it would spill out in small hidden ways, in how you stared at the ceiling, unable to sleep, in how you replayed old conversations in your mind, wondering if you'd made things weird, in how your chest ached with words you never let yourself say. You didn't cry often, not because you didn't want to, but because it never felt like there was room for it. There was always someone else's sadness, someone else's needs, and yours felt too fragile to matter. You weren't faking anything, that's what people misunderstand. You weren't pretending to be happy, you were surviving. Smiling was a way to manage things, to stop your emotions from spilling out and making a mess. No one was prepared to clean. It was your quiet way of saying, "I'll handle it." A smile became your boundary, your filter, your way of holding the chaos back just a little longer. And yet, even as you tried to protect others from your pain, you began to feel resentful, not because you didn't love them, but because you were starting to wonder if anyone loved you in return. Not the cheerful you, not the problem-solving you, not the always there for everyone, just you. The quiet, uncertain, aching version of you. The one who didn't always have a smile ready. The one who just wanted to rest. You might remember a time when someone told you you're always so strong, and you smiled again, nodded again, but inside you thought, I don't want to be strong all the time. But saying that out loud felt dangerous, like it would disappoint someone, like it would change how they saw you. So you kept holding it in, even when the strength they praised was slowly draining you. And there's something else you carried. Guilt. The guilt of not wanting to smile anymore. The guilt of wondering if maybe you deserved someone to ask how you were doing, without rushing the answer. The guilt of needing comfort, but not knowing how to ask for it. So you told yourself to be grateful. You reminded yourself of what you had. You compared your pain to someone else's, and decided it didn't count. And then you smiled again. But a part of you began to feel hollow, like the version of you they all knew was a character you didn't have the energy to play anymore. Like every compliment about your cheerfulness felt a little heavier, because what if they wouldn't stay if you stopped performing? What if their love was conditional, tied to the illusion that you were always okay? That fear started to shape how you moved through the world. You edited your messages to sound more upbeat. You laughed at things you didn't find funny. You brushed off concerns with jokes. You turned your pain into stories, and your stories into entertainment. Because being entertaining made you feel useful, and useful felt close enough to being wanted. There were times too when you tried to let your guard down, just a little, when you hinted at how tired you were, when you let a crack show, and sometimes people noticed. Sometimes they offered kind words, a quick hug, a "you've got this," but the moment passed quickly. too quickly, and you were left wondering if they really saw you, or just the version of you they needed you to be. So you withdrew again, not out of bitterness, but out of self-protection. You learned that vulnerability came with risk, the risk of being too much, the risk of being met with silence, and so you smiled harder. You became even more agreeable, even more accommodating, until even you forgot what you actually felt beneath it all. And now maybe, you're starting to feel the weight of all that pretending, not because it wasn't real. You really did care, you really did want to make things better for others, but somewhere along the way, you forgot that your comfort mattered too, that you didn't have to suffer in silence to be loved, that being needed and being known are not the same thing. You want someone to see the effort it takes, not just the smile, but the fight behind it, the nights you kept going when you didn't want to, the mornings you got up with nothing left to give, the moments you swallowed your truth, so someone else could be at peace. You want someone to notice, to say, I see how hard you're trying, and you don't have to try so hard here. But even as you crave that, you still hesitate, because it feels safer to smile than to risk being rejected for your truth. It feels easier to carry the weight than to hand it to someone who might drop it. It feels familiar, even comforting, to be the one who keeps the peace. And yet you're tired, so deeply tired, not just physically, but emotionally, spiritually, tired of smiling when you're not okay, tired of feeling like you need permission to fall apart, tired of wondering if anyone would stay if you stopped being easy. So you sit in the quiet again, thinking of all the versions of yourself you've hidden, all the truths you've softened, all the moments you've rewritten, so others wouldn't feel uncomfortable. And you wonder, just quietly, just to yourself, when will it be safe to be real? Maybe the hardest part wasn't even the pretending, it was the loneliness that followed. Not the kind of loneliness that comes from being alone in a room, but the kind that sits beside you while you're surrounded by people who only know the version of you that makes them feel comfortable. The kind that grows louder every time someone says you always seem so happy, and you just nod, because explaining the truth feels like too much work. Or maybe you're not even sure how to explain it anymore, not in a way they would understand. And so your smile became a language, one only you truly understood. It said things no one ever heard. I'm overwhelmed. I'm scared. I don't know how to stop being what everyone expects of me. But all they saw was teeth and lightness and composure. And you became fluent in silence. You became fluent in shrinking. You didn't mean to disappear. You were just trying to keep things calm, just trying to manage everything, without adding to the weight others already carried. You told yourself it was noble, that it was strength, that it was kindness. And maybe it was, but at the cost of your own truth. At the cost of the messy, beautiful, hurting, honest parts of you that needed space too. You started to feel like a ghost in your own story, like you were always on stage, performing lines written by someone else. And even when you wanted to speak up, to say something real, you worried it would ruin the scene, so you smiled instead. You always smiled, but even ghosts get tired, even masks begin to crack, and one day, maybe quietly, maybe all at once, you started to feel that crack inside you widen, not in a dramatic way, not with fireworks or explosions, just an ache, a whisper that said, I can't keep doing this. Not like this, not if it means continuing to erase yourself just to make others feel okay. You began to realize that the smile wasn't saving you anymore, that it wasn't keeping the peace, it was keeping you from being known. That it wasn't protecting relationships, it was protecting people from ever really having to care. And it broke your heart, didn't it? To think that maybe they only stayed because they didn't know how heavy your smile really was. There were moments when you imagined dropping it, just once, letting your real face show, letting someone see the exhaustion in your eyes, letting your voice tremble when you said, I'm not okay. But the fear always stepped in, What if they walked away? What if they looked at you differently? What if you weren't enough without the smile? So you kept holding it up, day after day, smile after smile, and the pain didn't go away. It just grew quieter, more settled, more familiar, until you began to wonder if maybe this was just who you were now, the person who carries, the person who comforts, the person who never needs, but you do need. You always have, even if you've forgotten how to say it, even if no one has ever stayed long enough to hear it. You need rest. You need understanding. You need someone to hold space for you without asking you to be okay first. You need to be able to take the smile off, not forever, not dramatically, just sometimes, just long enough to breathe, just long enough to remember who you are underneath all the performance. Because there's a softness in you that's been waiting, a quiet, beautiful, brave softness that deserves to be held, not fixed, not managed, just held. You are not weak for wanting that. You are not ungrateful for needing more than silence in return. You are not broken for feeling like you can't keep holding the world together with your teeth clenched behind a smile. You're human, a human who's been trying so hard, a human who has shown up again and again, even when no one noticed how heavy your chest felt, a human who has loved and cared, and given beyond your limit. And now you deserve to be seen. You deserve to smile when it's real, and cry when it's not. You deserve to be comforted, without having to perform first. You deserve to be the one who's asked, "How are you really?" and not be interrupted, when the answer is complicated. You deserve a world where your silence isn't mistaken for peace, where your smile isn't mistaken for ease, where your presence isn't mistaken for invincibility. You deserve the kind of love that looks past the grin, and says, even if you're not okay, I'm still here. And maybe slowly, you'll begin to believe that. Maybe you'll find spaces where it's safe to take the mask off. Maybe you'll meet people who don't need you to smile to be lovable. Maybe you'll become one of those people for yourself. And when that happens, when you start to smile, not because you have to, but because something in you truly feels light again, it will be the kind of smile that doesn't hide anything, the kind that's not carrying weight behind it, the kind that says, I am here, I am healing, and this time it's real. It became a habit. The words slipping out so easily, I'm fine, like they were programmed into your tongue. They didn't feel true, not even close, but they were safe, predictable, uncomplicated. They were the words that didn't require follow-ups, didn't shift the mood, didn't cause that awkward silence where someone wasn't sure how to help. I'm fine was how you kept everything smooth, manageable, and most of all, contained. But inside, you weren't fine. You were struggling, some days barely holding on, other days completely hollow, but still showing up. You didn't always know what was wrong, and maybe that was the hardest part. When the sadness didn't have a name, and the heaviness didn't have a clear cause, it felt easier to hide it than try to explain something you didn't even understand yourself. I'm fine became a wall, a smile painted across bricks. People asked, of course, how are you? In that way we all do, passing in hallways, during dinners, in texts. But you could hear it, the way their voices didn't pause long enough for an honest answer, the way their attention flickered even before you spoke. And in those moments, something inside you whispered, don't make this complicated. So you didn't. You said what they expected, what kept the conversation moving. You said, I'm fine. And maybe it wasn't just about them. Maybe it was about you too. Maybe you were afraid of what would happen if you told the truth. If you said, actually, I feel like I'm disappearing. Or I've been waking up with a knot in my chest that doesn't go away. What would they say to that? Would they hold it gently? Would they even stay? You couldn't risk it. So you protected them, and you protected yourself from the disappointment of not being understood. There were days when you almost said more, when the words lined up in your throat like a confession. I'm exhausted, I'm scared, I feel so far away from myself. But then you saw the tiredness in their face, or remembered the way someone once dismissed your pain, or how you were told you were being dramatic, or sensitive, or making things bigger than they were, and the words fell apart inside your chest, dissolving into a smaller, safer sentence. I'm fine. You weren't trying to lie. You just didn't know how to unravel everything you were carrying without falling apart in front of them. And falling apart in front of someone, that requires a kind of safety you rarely found. So instead you learnt to manage, to compartmentalize, to split yourself into versions, the one who smiles and jokes, the one who listens and supports, and the quiet one inside, who just needed someone to notice that fine wasn't the truth. And what hurt most wasn't just the loneliness, it was the way they accepted it, the way they didn't question your answer, the way they never asked again. You wanted someone to see through it, to say, I don't believe you, tell me what's really going on. But no one did, and over time it started to feel like your silence was the only part of you people could handle. So you adapted. You became fluent in emotional editing. When you were on the edge of a breakdown, you said you were just tired. When your heart was aching, you said you had a lot on your mind. When your eyes stung from holding back tears, you laughed and said you had allergies. You found a language that kept people close enough not to worry, but far enough that they didn't ask too many questions. And it worked. Until it didn't. Because I'm fine became a prison, a phrase that shut the door on connection. You longed to be held, but you had taught everyone to keep their distance. You needed someone to listen, but you had convinced them you had nothing to say. You needed rest, but you kept showing up like you were full of energy, and eventually even you started to forget how you really felt. You believed the performance. You wore it so well, but beneath all that, beneath the composure, beneath the polite replies and careful smiles, there was always that voice, soft, aching, persistent. What if someone knew? What if I didn't have to be fine? What if I could fall apart and still be loved? You didn't want to be a burden. That was the fear stitched into every I'm fine. You didn't want to be the reason someone sighed, or looked worried, or had to rearrange their day. So you carried it alone. Quietly, even proudly. But pain carried alone begins to echo. It changes the shape of your thoughts, your relationships, your sense of self, and sometimes you wondered, is this who I am now? The person who's always okay, even when they're not. You didn't get here all at once. It happened slowly. A disappointment here, a dismissal there, a moment where your vulnerability wasn't met with softness, so you adjusted. You survived. You became what the world rewarded. Pleasant, predictable, fine. But the cost was high, and it left you aching in ways you couldn't even name. Now maybe you're beginning to see it. The weight of always having to be okay, the quiet grief of being unseen, the pain of needing help, but never asking, the ache of giving love, and never knowing if it would be returned. And still, you say, I'm fine, because not being fine feels dangerous, and being honest feels like too much. But you're allowed to want more. You're allowed to hope for someone who hears that sentence, and gently replies, I don't believe you, and I'm not going anywhere. You're allowed to wish that one day, I'm not okay, will be met with open arms, not awkward silence. You're allowed to imagine a world where your feelings don't need to be minimized to be valid. And maybe, just maybe, that starts with you, with sitting in a quiet room and whispering to yourself, I'm not fine, and letting that be enough, letting that be real, letting that be seen. There's something hollow about saying I'm fine, when your insides are anything but. You don't even remember when it started to feel rehearsed, like an answer you memorized, rather than one you meant. It came out so easily, like muscle memory, not because it was the truth, but because it was safe. It was what people expected, what kept the conversation shallow, what kept the focus off you, and maybe part of you liked that, not being the center of attention, not having to explain the ache in your chest, or the fog in your mind, not having to figure out the words for something you didn't fully understand yourself. But the other part, the quiet part, it resented being silenced. It longed to be asked again, to be pressed gently, to be known, even in your struggle. But the world didn't ask twice. People heard what they wanted to hear. You're fine, gave them permission to move on, and so they did. They accepted it, believed it, let it close the door to something deeper, and you watched them walk away, smiling at your mask, never noticing the weight behind your eyes. That kind of loneliness is hard to describe, being surrounded but unseen, known only for the version of you that required no effort to love. You started keeping lists in your head, things you wanted to say, if someone ever really asked how you were. Not the polite version, not the easy one, the real one, the version that said, I feel empty even when I'm surrounded by people, or I haven't felt rested in months, no matter how long I sleep, or even sometimes I feel like I'm disappearing, and I don't know how to stop it. But no one asked, or if they did, it was the kind of asking that came with a time limit. So you said it again, I'm fine, and each time you did, you felt yourself pull back just a little more, like a curtain closing, like a light dimming. You didn't do it to be distant. You did it because hope was exhausting, because every time you let someone see a piece of the truth, and they brushed it off, it chipped away at your willingness to try again. And eventually the silence started to feel safer than disappointment. Sometimes you even tried to believe it. Maybe if you said it enough times, it would become true. Maybe if you smiled just right, laughed just enough, kept things light, the heaviness would lift. But it didn't. It just went underground, turned into headaches, and tight shoulders, and that ache in your throat, that never quite turned into tears. You carried it all neatly packed behind your ribs, while the world thanked you for being so positive. You became the master of redirection, turning every question back on them, shifting the topic, making jokes, giving advice, anything to keep the spotlight off your own unraveling. You told yourself it was easier this way, cleaner, kinder, that your pain was yours to hold, not something to hand off to someone else. But that logic only worked for so long, because there were nights when the silence grew too loud, when you stared at your ceiling, and thought, maybe if someone just asked the right way, I'd tell them everything. But no one did, or maybe they tried, but your walls were too well constructed. You'd spent so long being fine, that even you weren't sure what was beneath it anymore. And still, you showed up to work, to birthdays, to dinners, to conversations where your voice said, I'm okay, and your heart screamed something else entirely. You played the part well, so well that even when you broke, when the cracks finally showed, people were shocked. I had no idea, they said, and that hurt more than anything, because the signs were always there, just quiet, just polite, just easy to overlook. But you don't want to be invisible anymore. Not in that way. Not in the way that makes your pain easy to miss. You want to be known, not for your resilience, not for your ability to bounce back, but for your truth, for the parts of you that aren't polished, for the nights when I'm fine would be a lie, and you say something else instead, something real, something raw. You dream of that moment, where someone asks, and you don't flinch, where you answer honestly, and they don't pull away, where you say, actually, I'm not doing great, and the room doesn't fall silent, where the world keeps spinning even when your mask is off, where love doesn't shrink in the presence of your sadness. You're not there yet, and that's okay. This takes time, unlearning the reflex, rewriting the script, giving yourself permission to speak without shrinking. But maybe you've already started. Maybe just by reading this, just by nodding to yourself, you've taken the first step. And if no one's told you this yet, you don't owe the world a polished version of your pain. You don't have to package your feelings into bite-sized pieces so they're easier to digest. You don't have to keep saying, "I'm fine," just because it's the answer people prefer. You can be messy. You can be unsure. You can be deeply human. And still you are worthy of being listened to. There's a moment that stays with you. A time when you almost said what you really felt. You opened your mouth, heart pounding, the truth trembling on your tongue, but then you saw the look on their face. Distracted, rushed, unready, and something inside you folded back in. You smiled. You said it again. "I'm fine." And the door to your truth quietly closed, like it always does. You started to believe that maybe your feelings were just too much, too inconvenient, too undefined to be shared. It wasn't that you didn't feel, it was that you felt everything. And how do you explain that? How do you explain the way the smallest thing can shake you? The way joy and grief live side by side in you. The way you carry stories you've never told, wounds you never show. So you simplified. You nodded when you didn't agree, laughed when you didn't find it funny, comforted others while you were hurting. You mastered the art of emotional translation, turning storms into sentences, turning pain into politeness. Because that's what you thought strength was, saying, "I'm fine," even when you're breaking. But strength has nothing to do with silence. And it took you a long time to realize that pushing your truth down isn't bravery, it's fear wearing a smile. And while it kept things quiet, it also kept you disconnected, not just from others, but from yourself. You started losing track of your own emotions. When someone asked how you were, you didn't even pause to check. You just answered, automatically, and then moved on. But the body remembers what the mind tries to bury: the tension, the fatigue, the ache that no amount of rest could fix. It built slowly, quietly, until one day, even you couldn't pretend anymore. You had a breaking point. Maybe it was subtle, a tear in the bathroom at work, a cancelled plan with no explanation, a day when you turned your phone off just to breathe without having to answer to anyone. Or maybe it was louder, a panic attack, a fight, a moment when everything came out at once. Whatever it was, it reminded you that pretending has a cost, and that cost is you. You began to wonder, who would you be if you stopped saying, "I'm fine"? Who would still stay? Who would still listen? Who would still love you if you were honest about how often you feel lost? And slowly, you started to test it. Little moments of truth, letting your voice shake, saying, "I don't know" when you didn't have an answer, saying, "I'm tired," when your soul was exhausted. It didn't always go well. Some people grew quiet, some changed the subject, but others surprised you. Some stayed, some leaned in, some said, "Me too," and that changed something. It wasn't everything, not overnight, but it cracked the shell. It made room for something new, something real, a kind of connection that didn't require performance, a kind of love that didn't flinch at your flaws. You began to realize that "I'm fine" isn't a shield, it's a wall, and walls don't just keep pain in, they keep people out. So piece by piece you've started taking yours down, not all at once, not with everyone, but enough to breathe, enough to remember that your truth is not a burden, it's a bridge. You don't have to be fine all the time. You don't have to make your pain small, to make others comfortable. You don't have to shrink your emotions to fit into someone else's expectations. You can be loud in your sadness, clear in your exhaustion, honest in your need, and you will still be lovable.
You will still be worthy. You will still belong. And one day someone will ask how you are, and you'll pause, not out of fear, but out of care. You'll check in with yourself. You'll tell the truth, and you won't apologize for it. And maybe, just maybe, they'll respond with something you never expected to hear. Thank you for telling me. I'm here. And in that moment, everything you carried behind, I'm fine, will feel just a little bit lighter.
There's a strange kind of guilt that settles into your chest when a conversation fades into silence, and you immediately assume it's your fault. You've lived long enough with the echo of unspoken words to start thinking that maybe something in you causes the disconnect, that maybe your voice is too soft, your thoughts too much, your presence somehow not enough to fill the space. And so you rush in to fix it, to fill it, to make things comfortable again, even if no one asked you to, even if it wasn't yours to fix. You've become an expert at reading the pauses in people's speech, at noticing the subtle shift in their eyes when something you say doesn't land the way you hoped, at watching their expression just a second too long to make sure you didn't make things awkward, and when that silence stretches, even just a beat longer than usual, your mind starts to race. Was it something I said? Did I share too much? Did I make it weird? You weren't always like this, but somewhere along the way, silence stopped feeling like peace and started feeling like rejection. And that shift didn't come from nowhere. It came from all the times you were met with closed-off expressions, with cold shoulders, with disengaged responses when all you wanted was connection. So now, silence isn't neutral anymore. It's loaded, heavy, proof in your mind that you've done something wrong, even when no one tells you that you have. And the hardest part is, no one else seems to feel it the way you do. People say things like, don't take it personally, or they're just tired, or maybe they had something on their mind. And you try to believe them, you really do, but the quiet still curls around you like a shadow, whispering that you're the problem, that if you were more interesting, more likable, more something, the silence wouldn't have happened at all. So you start editing yourself. You keep things light. You filter your words. You choose stories that won't make anyone uncomfortable. Ask questions that don't dig too deep. Respond in ways that keep the energy going. You become less of yourself and more of what you think others want. And slowly, bit by bit, you begin to disappear from your own life. Not physically, just emotionally, quietly. You walk away from conversations replaying everything in your head, every word, every pause, every tone. You search for clues that maybe you went too far or didn't go far enough. And even when people say they enjoy your company, a part of you doesn't fully believe them. Because if they did, why do you feel so invisible? Why does the silence linger so long after they leave? It's exhausting. Always wondering what you did wrong. Always holding yourself responsible for how comfortable everyone else feels. Always assuming that if there's distance, it must be something you caused. It keeps you on edge. Keeps your heart in a constant state of defense. And worst of all, it keeps you from trusting the very thing you crave most: connection. You've spent so long trying to earn your place in every room, in every relationship, that you've forgotten you were already enough. That you didn't need to be perfectly worded, perfectly timed, perfectly composed to be worthy of presence and response. You didn't need to shrink just so no one else would feel crowded, but you did shrink. You still do. Even now, when you enter a space and feel the mood shift, your first thought isn't, maybe they're having a hard day. It's, what did I do wrong? You've made yourself the reason for everyone else's silence, not because it's true, but because it gives you something to control. If it's your fault, then at least it makes sense. At least it's predictable. That's the trap, isn't it? Blaming yourself gives the illusion of control. It feels safer to think you caused the silence than to accept that sometimes people just drift, or disconnect, or don't know how to show up. But that kind of safety costs you something. It costs you your peace, your presence, your self-trust. It turns every moment of quiet into a mirror, reflecting back a version of yourself you're constantly trying to fix. And the truth is, you don't need fixing. You never did. You were just trying to belong, trying to be enough in a world that often makes people like you feel like they're too much or not quite right. But that effort, that quiet bending of yourself has taken a toll. It's made you question your worth every time a room goes still. It's made you carry guilt for things that were never yours to carry. You deserve better than that. You deserve to walk into a room without scanning it for signs of rejection. You deserve to speak without overthinking. You deserve to exist in silence without thinking it means something's wrong with you. Because sometimes silence is just silence. Sometimes it means nothing. Sometimes people are tired, or lost in thought, or distracted, and none of that is a reflection of your worth. It's just life. It's just people being people. And slowly, gently, you can start to believe that. You can start to breathe in the pauses, to trust your presence even when the room feels quiet, to remind yourself that connection isn't something you have to earn by being perfect. It's something that grows in spaces where you are allowed to be real, even when the conversation runs out, even when the room falls silent, even when you say nothing at all. It's the kind of thing that people don't notice about you, how you always seem alert in the quiet moments, how your shoulders tense when conversations trail off, how you start offering explanations that no one asked for, because somewhere along the way, you learned that silence wasn't neutral. It was a warning, a signal that something had gone wrong, a subtle cue that you had failed to keep the room warm, the mood alive, the connection unbroken. You became the one who overcompensated. You learned how to pivot when the energy dropped. You laughed a little louder, filled in the blanks, asked more questions than you answered. You weren't trying to dominate the room. You were trying to protect it, to hold things together, to stop the space from going cold. But that responsibility, that quiet desperation to keep things flowing, began to seep into everything, into your friendships, into your family dinners, into every interaction where even a brief pause left you questioning your worth. And it didn't help that people praised you for it. They said you were so easy to talk to, so good at making others comfortable, so thoughtful, so intuitive, and you were, but they never saw the cost, the energy it took to manage every interaction like it was a delicate balancing act, the way your mind never really rested. The way you analyzed every silence like a map of your failures, because that's how it started to feel, like every quiet moment was proof that you hadn't done enough, that you hadn't been interesting enough, that maybe you were too much, or not enough, or just the wrong shape of person altogether. So instead of accepting the silence, you filled it, or worse, you filled yourself with blame. You sat in cars after long talks, replaying each minute, wondering if you should have phrased that differently, wondering if they grew distant because you'd said too much, or not enough, or looked at them the wrong way. You tried to fix it in your mind, rewriting the evening like a script, one where you were better, one where they stayed, and when people drifted away, as people sometimes do, you rarely allowed yourself the comfort of not knowing why. You decided it was you, that you said something that made them uncomfortable, that your presence was just a little too intense, that your silences, even though they were laced with love, didn't meet their needs. And that became your narrative, that if there's distance it must mean you weren't careful enough. But here's something you've started to understand. Silence is not always a signal of failure. It's not always a broken bridge. It doesn't always mean you did something wrong. Sometimes silence is just space. Sometimes it's people processing, or retreating into their own minds, or carrying their own invisible burdens that have nothing to do with you. But because you care so deeply, maybe too deeply, you try to take it all on. You try to explain away the distance,
so you don't have to sit with uncertainty. That's what this has always been about, hasn't it? Not just fear of silence, but fear of the unknown it brings. If someone doesn't respond, you imagine the worst. If someone pulls back, you assume you drove them away. If someone grows quiet, your first thought is that you broke something, because that kind of ambiguity, that not knowing, is louder than any silence could ever be, so you fill it with apologies, with explanations, with jokes, with noise, anything to make the quiet go away, anything to bring the connection back, even if it means shrinking yourself again, even if it means you walk away feeling smaller every time. And yet deep down, you long for something different. You long to be in a room where you can be quiet without guilt, where pauses aren't panic buttons, where you're allowed to just be, without constantly adjusting to keep others comfortable. You long for connection that doesn't require your constant vigilance, but that begins with you, with slowly, gently unlearning the idea that you must be the one to hold it all together, with releasing the belief that silence equals failure, with trusting that your presence, quiet or loud, is not something people must be convinced to stay for. You are not a host trying to entertain the world into loving you. You are a person, worthy of stillness, worthy of pause, worthy of connection that doesn't fall apart in the quiet. And yes, there will still be days when silence feels like a weight pressing down on your chest. There will still be moments when someone's lack of response spirals into self-doubt. But you are learning to pause and ask yourself a softer question: is this really about me? And more often than not, the answer will be no. You can sit in a room without filling it. You can be part of a conversation without steering it. You can exist in someone's life without entertaining your way into their heart. And you can let silence be what it is, not a punishment, not a signal of your inadequacy, but simply space. Space that does not need to be filled with blame. It's a habit now. This constant scanning, this inner radar always on alert for what went wrong, even when nothing did. You enter a room and instantly begin measuring yourself against invisible standards. Did I speak too much? Too little? Did I misread the tone? Did I say something that pushed them away? Even when no one says anything, especially when no one says anything, you brace yourself for rejection, because that's how silence feels to you now. Not like space, but like distance. Not like rest, but like judgment. You weren't born this way. This fear was learned, one slow moment at a time. Maybe from a parent who went quiet when they were angry but never explained why. Maybe from friends who ghosted instead of saying what was wrong. Maybe from early days in classrooms, or family dinners, or long car rides, where the quiet was heavy with tension you didn't know how to name. And so you learned to see stillness as danger, as something you were supposed to fix, as something you caused. And when people started pulling away, in texts, in tone, in presence, you stopped questioning their reasons, and started blaming yourself. It didn't matter if they were tired, or distant, or busy with their own battles. It didn't matter if the silence had nothing to do with you. In your mind, silence always meant you failed, so you performed, smiled harder, asked more questions, tried to fill every pause before it could swallow you. You became so good at managing the atmosphere around you that you stopped tending to the storm inside you, and no one noticed. Why would they? You were so careful, so warm, so easy to be around. You made sure of it. But behind every sentence, behind every effort to keep things flowing, was a quiet ache. Will they leave if I stop trying? That's the question that shaped everything. That's why silence wasn't just uncomfortable, it was terrifying, because you associated quiet with abandonment, and to avoid that you made yourself small, agreeable, always available. You stopped showing up as your whole self, and started curating versions of yourself that would never cause discomfort, never cause someone to pull back, never cause the silence you feared. And yet, even with all that effort, people still left sometimes. They still drifted, still grew distant, and it crushed you, not just because of the loss, but because it confirmed what you'd always feared, that maybe it was your fault, that maybe the silence really had meant something, that maybe you were the reason people stopped responding, stopped trying, stopped choosing you. But that pain, that crushing, all-consuming pain, didn't mean your belief was true. It only meant it felt true. And there's a difference. There always has been, because people carry their own silences, their own unresolved fears, their own emotional bandwidth, and sometimes, when they fall quiet, it has nothing to do with you at all, but you never learned how to sit with that ambiguity, so you filled it with blame. You made yourself the cause, so you didn't have to face the deeper ache, the ache of not knowing, the ache of not being in control, and you kept doing it, kept shouldering the invisible weight, kept trying to do better, be enough. You thought if you could just be more interesting, more lovable, more stable, the silences would stop, that people would stay, that connection would last. But connection doesn't work like that. You can't perform your way into being understood. You can't sacrifice your authenticity and then wonder why you still feel unseen. What you're realizing now is this silence is not your enemy, and it's not your responsibility to fix. It's not your job to fill every moment with noise, so people don't get uncomfortable. It's not your burden to carry other people's withdrawal as a reflection of your worth. Sometimes, people go quiet because they don't know how to express what's in them. Sometimes they pull away because they're scared, and sometimes, they just don't know how to stay. That's not your fault. You are not a repair shop for the emotional gaps of others. You are not a buffer between awkwardness and comfort. You are not a constant entertainer, designed to keep people from drifting. You are a person, full of emotion, silence, depth, contradiction, and you deserve to be in spaces where your presence is welcome, even when you have nothing to say, even when the room is quiet, even when you're just there, and you're learning, slowly, gently, you're learning to pause before you apologize for something you didn't do. You're learning to breathe in the spaces that once made you panic. You're learning to say, this silence isn't mine to carry. And maybe most of all, you're learning to stop editing yourself just to be tolerated, because you deserve to be understood, not just for the things you say, but for the things you don't, for the thoughts you hold back, for the parts of you that aren't always polished, for the presence you bring, even when it's quiet. You don't have to keep blaming yourself for every silence in the room. You don't have to keep believing that your worth is measured by how comfortable others feel around you. You can be still, you can be uncertain, you can be quiet, and you will still matter. You always did.
There are few wounds that cut deeper than being called lazy when, deep inside, you were trying so hard just to exist. You heard the word like a judgment, like a stamp across your forehead that erased all the effort no one saw. It didn't matter that you'd been dragging yourself through the day, your body heavy, your mind loud and tangled. To them, from the outside, you looked still, and so they called it laziness. But they didn't see the war you were fighting just to get out of bed. They didn't see the mountain your mind turned every task into. They didn't hear the way your thoughts spun and spiraled before you could move. They just saw what you didn't do, what wasn't finished, what you forgot, what you postponed. And in their eyes, that was enough to define you. And so the word stuck, not just in their mouths, but in your mind. You began whispering it to yourself every time you couldn't get started, every time you sat too long, every time you stared at your screen or your wall or the pile of clothes that needed folding. Lazy, you told yourself. You're lazy. What's wrong with you? Why can't you just do it? The shame was relentless, but the truth, the one you rarely said out loud, is that you were never lazy. You were overwhelmed. You were burnt out. You were lonely. You were scared. You were tired in ways sleep couldn't fix. You were fighting invisible battles while the world demanded visible progress. And that's the kind of pain no one applauds. The kind no one gives you credit for. You started to measure yourself against everyone else's pace, their routines, their checklists, their smiling photos. You watched them move through their lives with seeming ease and wondered why it felt so impossible for you. Why even the simplest task felt like trying to walk through water. You assumed it meant you were broken, flawed, less than. But no one ever taught you that invisible effort counts too. That mental exhaustion is real. That emotional labor doesn't show up on to-do lists. So you pushed. You forced yourself to keep going, even when your body was screaming for rest. Even when your mind was foggy and your heart felt far away. You punished yourself for every slow moment. You called it procrastination when it was actually paralysis. You called it laziness when it was actually depletion. And the more you criticized yourself, the harder everything became. And maybe the worst part was the silence. The absence of understanding, the way people dismissed your struggle because they couldn't see it. Because in their world, effort had to look like movement. It had to be loud, visible, productive. So when you were still, when you pulled away, when you collapsed inward, they misunderstood. They made assumptions. And they named your pain. Something it never was, but you were trying. Even when it looked like nothing. Even when all you did that day was survive. Even when your only victory was not giving up. You were trying in ways no one could measure. In ways that didn't earn praise. In ways that felt invisible, but were everything. And in your quiet moments, you felt the weight of it. The desire to explain. To defend yourself, to say, I'm not lazy, I'm hurting. But the words got stuck, and so you carried the shame in silence, adding it to the pile of things you were already trying to carry. You're not weak because you need rest. You're not broken because your energy comes and goes. You're not less because your effort doesn't look like everyone else's. You are still worthy on your slow days, on your undone days, on your barely held it together days. You deserve kindness, not just when you're succeeding, but when you're struggling. You deserve understanding, not just from others, but from yourself. You deserve to rewrite that voice in your head that keeps calling you lazy and replace it with one that says, you're doing the best you can. And that's enough, because it is enough, and you are not alone. There's something quietly heartbreaking about being misunderstood by the people closest to you, especially when you were already trying so hard. You were showing up in the ways you could, pushing against exhaustion that had no shape, trying to look normal, when everything inside you felt heavy and unnameable. But all they noticed was what wasn't done. All they saw was the task unfinished, the step you didn't take, the hesitation that lived where energy used to be. And so they called you lazy, as if that word could ever explain what was really happening. You didn't argue, not out loud, at least. You nodded, maybe laughed, maybe shrugged it off. But the words clung to your skin like dust. They crept into your inner voice, became part of the way you narrated your own life. Suddenly you weren't just tired, you were failing. You weren't just overwhelmed, you were disappointing. You weren't just quiet, you were wasting time. That word blurred the line between your survival and their expectations, and you let it stay. What they didn't see was the number of times you almost got up, the number of times you made a list, made a plan, sat at the edge of your bed trying to will your body into movement, the number of times you tried to snap out of it, only to feel yourself slide deeper into something wordless and cold. But when you live in a world that values output over emotion, no one claps for trying, no one applauds rest, no one sees the quiet battle of brushing your teeth on a bad day, or replying to one message when your mind feels like static. You started resenting your own pace, the way everything took more time, the way your energy never matched the rhythm of those around you, and it built into shame, a deep, exhausting shame that followed you into every task. You began to dread doing anything, Not because the task itself was hard, but because you'd already decided you were failing at it before you even began. The pressure to feel motivated became another burden, and the more you pushed, the more drained you felt. They said things like "just do it," or "you have so much potential," and maybe they meant it as encouragement, but to you it felt like a reminder of how far away you were from who you used to be, or who you were supposed to be. Because potential means nothing when your body feels like it's underwater and your brain is trapped in fog. You heard those words and translated them into "why aren't you better by now?" And the truth is, you wanted to be better. You tried to be better. You told yourself you just needed to focus, just needed to be more disciplined, just needed to stop making excuses. You internalized every toxic mantra disguised as motivation. You turned your exhaustion into a personal failure, and that's not fair. To your body, to your mind, to the heart of you that was doing its best with what it had. You're starting to realize now that survival isn't always visible, that some days effort looks like rest, like making a meal, like doing one small thing, and forgiving yourself for the rest, that trying isn't always loud, that you don't owe productivity as proof of your worth. You don't need to move mountains every day to earn love, respect, or belonging. You've lived long enough in the gap between effort and expectation, long enough carrying guilt that wasn't yours, long enough calling yourself lazy for experiencing burnout or depression, or grief that wore 1,000 different faces. You've punished yourself for being tired in a world that glorifies hustle. You've apologized for your limitations instead of honoring them. But maybe today, you don't. Maybe today you soften the voice that demands you prove your value through constant doing. Maybe you pause and acknowledge what you have done, not just what's unfinished. Maybe you stop measuring your day by what's visible to others and start measuring it by how gently you treated yourself. Maybe you forgive yourself for being human. You are not lazy, you are layered, complex, weathered by things most people never see. You are someone who's been carrying things in silence, doing the best you can with the weight you've been given, and that deserves compassion, not criticism. That deserves patience, not pressure. You are still trying, even when it didn't look like it, even when the world said otherwise. And that effort, that invisible, quiet, aching effort, it matters. You matter, still, always. Even here, it's strange how the words that hurt most are the ones that echo the loudest, even when they were never true. Lazy. It wasn't just a word someone threw at you once. It became something that followed you around, lurking in the corners of every undone task, every late start, every day you needed more rest than the world seemed to allow. It wasn't just a label, it became a lens. You began to see yourself through it, to measure your worth against it, to question your value because of it. And still, through that shame, you tried. Quietly, tenderly, sometimes desperately. You tried to be better though you didn't even know what that meant anymore. You tried to move faster, to be more consistent, to keep up with others who didn't seem to struggle like you did. You watched them check boxes, set routines, finish goals, and wondered why it felt so different for you. Why your own efforts left you more exhausted than energized. Why the smallest step sometimes felt like a climb. But effort doesn't always look the same. Trying doesn't always look like progress. And you were trying even when you didn't get out of bed until noon. Even when your to-do list remained untouched. Even when you cancelled plans for the third time in a row because you couldn't find the energy to pretend. You were trying in ways that didn't show up on the outside. You were keeping yourself afloat in silence, and no one knew how much strength that took. You carried that strength without recognition, without applause, without understanding. You showed up anyway, in bits and pieces, in small gestures, in quiet victories no one else could see. And when people made comments about your pace, your habits, your lack of discipline, it hurt. Not just because they misunderstood you,
but because you had already been fighting that same voice inside your head, the one that never gave you credit for surviving. You started believing that maybe you weren't just lazy, but broken, that maybe something was wrong with you for finding things so hard, that maybe you didn't belong in a world that moved so fast. But you were never broken. You were tired. You were stretched thin. You were carrying emotional weight that compounded every simple task. You were in recovery, from burnout, from anxiety, from self-neglect, and recovery is work too. You may not have a schedule that looks like theirs. You may not cross things off as quickly, or move through your days with effortless rhythm, but you've been learning how to show up with intention, how to forgive yourself on the slow days, how to celebrate progress even when it's quiet. You've been learning how to live with care, not pressure, with softness, not shame. And maybe you still struggle. Maybe some mornings are still heavy, and some tasks still linger longer than you want them to. Maybe some part of you still hears that old voice calling you lazy when your energy dips. But now you're learning to question it, to speak back, to replace it with something kinder, something truer. You don't have to earn rest. You don't have to explain your pace. You don't have to carry other people's definitions of effort and apply them like a measuring tape to your own life. You get to define what trying looks like for you. You get to honor what your body and mind need, even when it doesn't make sense to others. And the people who truly see you, they'll never need proof of your effort. They'll never reduce your complexity to a single word. They won't call you lazy just because they don't understand your struggle. They'll stay. They'll listen. They'll believe you when you say, "I'm doing the best I can," because you are. And if no one else says it, let this be the voice that does. You were still trying. Even in the quiet, even in the stillness, even when all you managed to do was breathe, and that too is worthy.
It was subtle, the way it crept in. That quiet realization that no one had really asked. Not in the way you needed. Not in the way that goes beneath the surface and waits patiently for the truth. You had answered so many "how are you?" questions with reflexive ease, with polite smiles and vague words, and no one had ever paused long enough to notice that you weren't fine. They accepted your mask because it was easier, because comfort is often chosen over truth and politeness over presence. That night it hit you all at once. You had been holding so much unspoken pain, unanswered fears, stories too tangled to tell. And in all the spaces you moved through, you couldn't remember the last time someone really looked at you and meant it. Meant the question. Meant to listen. Meant to stay through the silence after your answer. You tried not to resent them. These people you loved, these people who shared moments with you. You reminded yourself they had their own storms, their own blind spots, their own ways of interpreting silence. But still, there was an ache born not from anger, but from being consistently overlooked in the softest of ways. It wasn't that they didn't care, it was that they didn't see, and that absence of noticing became its own kind of loneliness. You had been loud once, or maybe just more open. You'd tried to share, not always with perfect timing or perfect language, but with honesty. And sometimes the responses were awkward, rushed, dismissive. They changed the subject. They joked it off. They said, "You'll be fine," or "Don't think too much." So you stopped sharing, not suddenly, just gradually, word by word, feeling by feeling, until one day you realized you hadn't told anyone anything real in a very long time. You became the one who asked the questions, who listened, who nodded at the right times and offered warmth where yours had not been met. You became the caretaker, the steady one, the safe space for everyone else. And you didn't mind, not really, except when the silence stretched too far and the loneliness turned sharp. There's something exhausting about always being the one who listens, always being the one who knows everyone else's pain, while yours sits untouched. Always holding space for others, but rarely being invited into that same kind of space. It begins to make you wonder if your feelings are too complex, too messy, too inconvenient to hold. If maybe your pain is just easier left unspoken, and maybe it is. Maybe you've become so good at looking composed that they stopped wondering what was underneath. Maybe your silence became part of the background, familiar, unthreatening, forgettable. You played the part so well that no one noticed it was a performance. But that night when the realization landed, the one that told you no one had asked, it didn't come with bitterness. It came with grief, a soft, weary grief for all the versions of you that had wanted to be known. All the times you answered honestly in your head, while your voice said something else. All the ways you'd hoped someone would notice, would press gently, would stay long enough to witness the truth without rushing to fix it. And you wondered what would it feel like to be asked, really asked and believed. What would it feel like for someone to sit with your answer, however tangled it was, and not try to clean it up? What would it feel like to be listened to without interruption? To be held in silence that wasn't empty, but present? You've known a lot of people, you've had conversations, shared stories, laughed with sincerity, but presence, real, grounded, consistent presence, that's been rare, and it's no one's fault. Not really. The world moves fast. People are tired. Attention is fleeting. But still, it hurts. It hurts to be known, only in pieces. It hurts to be loved for the version of you that doesn't need too much. It hurts to feel like the only way to belong is to stay quiet about what matters most to you. And now in this quiet moment, you wonder if maybe there's someone out there who would ask, who could stay, who might see your silence, not as a wall, but as a doorway, who wouldn't flinch if you said, "Actually, I'm not okay." But until then, until that presence arrives, you're learning to sit with yourself in the asking. You're learning to turn the question inward, "How am I?" and then to answer without judgment. To offer yourself the attention others forgot to give, to listen, to stay, to hold space for your own truth, even if no one else has yet. You began to notice the patterns, after that night, the way conversations stayed on the surface, the way people told you their stories, but never paused long enough to hear yours, the way they expected you to be available, responsive, thoughtful, without ever offering the same in return. And maybe you'd accepted it for too long, chalked it up to being the strong one, the quiet one, the one who didn't ask for much. But now, that realization sat heavy in your chest. They never really asked. You remembered moments when you'd hinted at your struggle, not with dramatic words, but in subtle shifts. A sigh, a longer pause, a soft "I'm just tired." You waited to see if anyone would notice, if anyone would tilt their head, lower their voice, and ask again, ask better, ask with care, but they didn't. They nodded, moved on, and every time you folded yourself up a little more, tighter, quieter, until the parts of you that needed the most love were barely breathing. It wasn't always cruelty. Sometimes it was distraction. Sometimes it was a mismatch of timing, but sometimes it was simply that they didn't know how to hold what you carried, and instead of admitting that, they looked away. They let you carry it alone, and the ache that followed wasn't just sadness, it was the deep loneliness of being surrounded and still feeling unknown. So you stopped waiting for the question, you stopped hoping for the check-ins, the late-night texts, the unexpected "how's your heart today?" You built your world around silence, not because you wanted to, but because it was safer than disappointment, because pretending not to need anyone felt better than needing someone who couldn't show up. But the need didn't go away, it just got buried. It showed up in dreams, in exhaustion that sleep couldn't touch, in the ache behind your eyes when you said, "I'm good," too many times in a row. It showed up in resentment, not loud or cruel, but quiet, passive, unspoken, the kind of resentment that whispers. You would have noticed if you really cared. You became good at hiding that too, at loving people through your disappointment, at being kind even when you felt invisible, at holding your bitterness in one hand and your compassion in the other, because deep down, you didn't want to stop loving, you just wanted to be loved back, in the same depth, with the same softness, with the same curiosity that you offered so freely, and yet asking for that felt dangerous, vulnerable, like opening a door no one had knocked on. So you stayed quiet, not because you had nothing to say, but because you weren't sure anyone would stay long enough to hear it. You'd learned that most people liked you best when you didn't need too much, when your emotions came in manageable doses, when your grief had clean edges. But your grief never had clean edges. It spilled out in strange ways, in over-apologizing, in emotional distance, in overthinking every text you sent, and you hated that about yourself. Hated that your need for connection came out sideways, that you couldn't just say, "I feel unseen, and it's hurting me." You were scared it would make people pull away, and that fear was older than most of your friendships. You tried to make peace with it, to tell yourself that not everyone is meant to stay, that some people are only meant to pass through, and that's true, sometimes, but it's also true that you deserve more, that you deserve to be asked, that you deserve to be known in ways that don't require performance, that you deserve to be held in your messy, uncertain, quiet truth, not just in your strength. You imagined once what it would feel like for someone to reach out on a random evening and say, "Hey, you've been on my mind. Are you really okay?" Not because something was wrong, not because you said anything, but because they were paying attention, because they noticed your absence in a room full of noise, because they wanted to know. And maybe that's the kind of love you're learning to wait for now, the kind that asks without being prompted, that listens without fixing, that holds space without fear, the kind that doesn't see your silence as emptiness, but as depth, something sacred, something worth staying for, until that love arrives, in a friend, in a partner, in someone who stays. You are becoming that for yourself. You are becoming the one who asks, the one who sits in the silence and listens, the one who says, "Tell me everything, even the things you don't know how to say." You are learning that the presence you offer others is something you can turn inward, that you are allowed to sit with yourself in all your complexity, without rushing, without fixing, without shame. You are allowed to be the one who needed someone, and still became someone. Maybe the worst part wasn't that they didn't ask. It was how long it took you to admit that it mattered, how long you convinced yourself that you didn't need to be asked, that it was enough to be in their lives, even if you weren't really seen, that being near them, hearing their laughter, answering their texts, that somehow meant you were okay. But deep down, something felt hollow, and you kept trying to fill it by being more available, more kind, more present, as if giving more of yourself would finally earn the kind of presence you were silently aching for. In return, you didn't want grand gestures. You didn't need someone to fix you or carry your weight. You just wanted to be noticed, to be asked in a way that didn't feel obligatory, to be listened to, without having to perform the right tone or package your pain into something palatable. You didn't want pity, just presence. And for some reason, that felt like too much to hope for. So you told yourself stories, that people were busy, that maybe they didn't know how, that your silence was too quiet for anyone to hear, that if you really needed something, you should have spoken louder. But why should love require shouting? Why should being seen require unraveling completely first? You became the kind of person who read between the lines, who noticed when someone's voice changed, when someone paused too long before answering. You paid attention to what people didn't say, and you responded with tenderness.
You asked again when they said they were fine. You stayed when the room got quiet. You held space even when you didn't understand. And in doing that you became the very thing you were always hoping to receive. But even that became a weight. Because being the one who notices, who stays, who listens, it's beautiful, yes, but it's also lonely when no one does the same for you. You carried everyone else's stories while your own gathered dust in the corners of your heart. You offered safety and warmth and presence, while your own silence went unrecognized. You tried to tell yourself it didn't matter, that some people aren't built to ask, that love looks different for everyone, and sometimes that helped. Sometimes it allowed you to keep offering without resentment, but other times, in the middle of the night, or in the quiet after a long day, the ache came back, that deep familiar ache of being around people who liked the light in you, but never asked about the shadows. And still you kept hoping, even if you didn't say it out loud, even if you masked it behind self-sufficiency and strength, even if you played the role of low-maintenance friend so well that no one thought to ask you what was underneath. You hoped for one person, one moment, one question that went beyond the surface and stayed long enough to hear the answer. It hasn't happened yet, or maybe it has, but not in the way you imagined. Maybe someone asked and you weren't ready to be known. Maybe they stayed, but you were too afraid to let them in. Or maybe, and this is just as true, maybe no one has asked because they're used to the version of you who never needed to be asked. And that's not your fault. You were just doing what you learned to be easy, to be okay, to be the one who holds it together. But even the strong need softness. Even the listeners need to be heard. Even the ones who seem fine need someone to say, I know you don't talk about it, but I'm here whenever you're ready. You're not asking for too much. You're not being dramatic. You're not needy for wanting to feel emotionally safe. You're human, and humans long for connection that goes beyond the surface. You're allowed to want someone who meets your silence with curiosity, who doesn't assume your calm means you're okay, who doesn't wait for a breakdown before they check in. Until that person comes, and they will come, you can begin with yourself. You can notice the places inside that have gone too long without a voice. You can sit with your own stories, even the ones that hurt. You can learn how to ask yourself the questions you always wished someone else would, and you can answer honestly, gently, without rushing to move past the discomfort, because healing doesn't always come from others. Sometimes it comes from finally acknowledging your own ache and refusing to ignore it anymore. They may not have asked, but you can, and that matters more than you know.
It was never a conscious decision. You didn't wake up one day and say, I will carry everyone else's weight. It just happened. Slowly, softly, piece by piece. Someone shared their sadness, and you leaned in. Someone was angry, and you softened your voice. Someone needed help, and you dropped what you were holding without even thinking. You did it because it felt right, because caring came naturally to you, or maybe because no one ever modeled what it looked like to care for yourself first. You noticed things others missed. The way someone's tone changed mid-sentence. The way their smile flickered when a certain topic came up. You remembered the names they only whispered once. You showed up, often before they even asked. You were the check-in, the comfort, the calm in the storm. And in return you didn't ask for much. Maybe a thank you. Maybe nothing at all. You weren't keeping score. You just wanted them to feel less alone. But over time something inside you began to feel hollow. Not all at once, not loud, but gradually. A quiet depletion that settled into your bones. You kept showing up, but it took more out of you. You listened, but it hurt deeper. You offered help, but a voice inside you began whispering, when will someone do this for me? You pushed that voice away. It felt selfish. It felt like weakness. You told yourself that caring was your role, your nature, your strength. That not everyone is built to notice like you do, to give like you do, to feel like you do, and maybe that's true. But just because you're capable of carrying so much doesn't mean you should have to. Just because you love deeply doesn't mean you should have to love alone. You began to realize that caring had come at a cost you never tallied, because love wasn't a transaction, but it showed up in other ways. In the friendships where you always reached out first, in the relationships where your emotions were too much, but your support was never questioned. In the way people leaned on you like a lighthouse, stable, unwavering, but never asked what kept your light burning. You started to resent it, quietly, guiltily, the imbalance, the assumption that you would always understand, always bend, always forgive. You were expected to be the healer, the fixer, the steady one. And if ever you faltered, if ever you needed too much, the room grew quiet. People disappeared. You learned that your pain didn't fit the version of you they had come to rely on, so you tucked it away. Again, you became more selective with your truths. You told yourself that this was just how it was, that some people give more, that some hearts are just made to be broken open for others. And yet, late at night, you would lie awake wondering why no one saw you, really saw you. Why the ones you held so carefully never thought to ask what it was costing you to care so much. And the cost? It wasn't just exhaustion, it was identity. You began to define yourself by your usefulness, by your ability to love without limits. You forgot who you were outside of being needed. You stopped asking what you needed. You called it loyalty, or compassion, or maturity, but it was also fear. Fear that if you stopped giving, they would stop staying. You wanted so badly to be chosen, not for what you could do, but for who you were when you weren't doing anything at all. But the love you kept receiving was conditional, dependent on your energy, your softness, your availability. So you kept pouring even when your own cup was dry, and the world kept drinking. Now maybe you're beginning to ask the harder questions. What if you deserve to be cared for without having to earn it? What if you are worthy of love that notices you, not just the comfort you provide? What if the weight you've been carrying isn't yours to hold anymore? Because there is a difference between caring and overextending, between loving and self-abandoning, between giving and forgetting that you are also allowed to receive. And it's not too late to remember that difference, to rewrite the rules, to say, I matter too. You're not selfish for wanting that. You're not weak for needing it. You're not broken because you can't hold everyone forever. You're human, and you've given enough without asking for anything. Maybe now it's time to ask. Maybe now it's time to let someone carry you for a while. Or, if no one else is ready, to begin carrying yourself with the same care you've always offered so freely to others. You started noticing how much smaller you became in the presence of other people's needs. Not because they asked you to shrink, but because you thought it would make things easier, smoother, more peaceful. You told yourself that your feelings could wait, that your voice wasn't urgent, that their pain took priority, and maybe in the beginning that felt noble, loving, even right. But over time it began to chip away at your sense of self, like a slow erosion you couldn't name until you were standing in the mirror, wondering where you'd gone. Being the one who cared meant you were always bending. You were flexible, accommodating, gentle. You held back your opinions when they didn't match the room. You quieted your disappointments, so no one would feel blamed. You minimized your boundaries in case they made someone uncomfortable. You stretched yourself into shapes that pleased others, and called it connection. But connection that cost you your wholeness isn't connection at all. It's sacrifice. And sacrifice, done silently and repeatedly, turns into self-abandonment. There were times you'd go home and feel heavy, not from any one moment, but from the accumulation of 100 little surrenders. Times you said yes when you wanted to say no. Times you stayed when you were aching to leave. Times you smiled through discomfort because you didn't want to be the reason someone else felt rejected. You told yourself you were kind, that this is what kind people do. But kindness shouldn't mean bleeding for people who don't notice you're hurting. You've built a life around holding others, around noticing their wounds, anticipating their needs, soothing their insecurities, and you're good at it. Almost too good. So good that people forget you might be struggling, too. So good that they stop asking. And without realizing it, you've trained the world to believe that you are always okay, that you always have space, that you never need what you give. And when you do speak up, when you say you're tired, when you ask for a little more time, when you admit that something hurt, it doesn't always land. People are surprised, uncomfortable. Some even push back, saying things like, "But you're always the strong one," or "You're usually so chill," as if your emotional range is something that needs explaining, as if you're only allowed to exist inside the version of you they've grown used to. So you retreat. You pull your truth back inside. You decide it's safer not to ask, safer not to need, safer to keep being the one who gives. At least that way, no one can leave because you are too much. At least that way, you remain the steady one, the good one, the one who never complicates anything. But even if you don't say it, your body keeps the score. Your fatigue grows louder. Your mind grows foggier. Your chest grows tighter. And eventually it's not just emotional pain. It's physical. It's the headache you wake up with. The knot in your stomach before a call. The tension in your jaw from biting your words back. It's all the ways your nervous system tries to tell you, you are not okay, you need care too. And still the world keeps asking, can you talk? Can you help? Can you listen? Can you carry just one more thing? And because it's you, because you're the one who always says yes, you do, even when it empties you, even when there's nothing left, and no one asks what it costs. No one sees the part of you that's quietly breaking from always being strong. But now maybe, you're ready to ask that question yourself, to stop and consider, what is it costing me to be the one who always understands? Because understanding shouldn't require erasing your own needs. Loving shouldn't require you to disappear. It's okay to want reciprocity. It's okay to expect care in return. It's okay to be the one who says, I need help today. That doesn't make you less loving. It makes you honest. And honesty, real raw human honesty, is the foundation of any love worth having. You've given so much, and maybe you'll keep giving, because that's who you are. But from now on, let your giving include yourself. Let your love stretch inward too. Let your care return home. You are not a machine. Not a mirror, not a reservoir for other people's pain. You are a person, and you deserve to be met, not just admired for your strength, but held in your softness, not just thanked for your presence, but cherished for your needs, not just loved for what you give, but simply for who you are. You never meant to become the person who had to be okay all the time. It just happened. At first you were proud of it, proud to be dependable, proud to be the one people leaned on. You liked being trusted, being seen as wise or grounded or emotionally strong. It felt like a kind of purpose, a quiet identity that gave shape to your days. But somewhere along the way, it stopped feeling like purpose and started feeling like pressure. Not spoken, not written anywhere, just a weight you carried, silently, because everyone expected you to. And when the cracks began to show, when you felt overwhelmed, or withdrawn, or quietly resentful, it confused even you. Because weren't you supposed to be good at this? Wasn't this your strength? You began to question yourself. Why does this hurt now? Why does giving feel like losing? Why does being there for others feel like no one is there for me? But you kept showing up anyway. You kept pouring even when the well inside you was running dry. Because caring felt like a duty. Because if you stopped, who would? It's a lonely thing.
caring so deeply in a world that doesn't always return it. You waited, not for grand gestures, but for something simple, a text without reason, a moment where someone remembered the small things you said, an invitation without needing to initiate, just some sign that you mattered outside of your ability to help. But too often it didn't come, and so you learned to lower the volume of your longing, to want less, to need less, to stop asking, and yet the ache never left. It followed you into your quiet moments. It appeared when you finished listening to someone, and they didn't ask how you were, when you celebrated someone's joy, and they didn't notice your silence, when you comforted someone's storm, and no one checked to see if you were standing in the rain too. These weren't big betrayals, but they were sharp, and over time those tiny cuts became scars. You no longer knew how to explain. You told yourself this was love. That love meant sacrifice. That caring meant always being the one who bends. You turned your tenderness into a shield, and your exhaustion into a secret, and it worked. You kept the peace. You stayed the steady one, but it came at the cost of being known, because no one can truly know you if they only ever meet the version of you that never asks for anything. And maybe that's the deepest grief of all, that the love you offered so freely didn't teach people how to love you back, that your care created comfort, but not reciprocity, that your presence was valued, but your absence went unnoticed. It hurts. It's okay to say that. It's okay to admit that being the one who cares doesn't mean you don't crave care yourself. You are allowed to want more than just being useful. You are allowed to want someone who notices the heaviness in your voice, who offers you rest before you collapse, who holds you not because you asked, but because they saw. You are allowed to want to be met, not just managed, to be chosen, not just needed. And if you haven't had that yet, if the people you've poured into never poured back, it doesn't mean you were wrong to love them. It just means you're allowed to make different choices now. Choices that honor your tenderness. Choices that protect your energy. Choices that say, I'm no longer giving to be seen. I'm giving because it's who I am. But I will not give myself away anymore. The cost has been high, but you're learning. Learning to recognize the difference between being generous and being depleted. Between being loyal and being unvalued. Between being kind and being walked over. You're learning that your heart is precious. Not because it can hold so much, but because it deserves to be held too. You don't have to stop caring. You just have to start including yourself in the care. You have to stop making others comfort your only priority. You have to stop shrinking in rooms that ask for your help, but never offer you healing. You have to stop waiting for someone to give you permission to rest. You've been enough all along, even when you were exhausted, even when your smile was heavy, even when you said, I'm okay, and no one looked deeper. You are not what you do for others. You are not how useful you are. You are not just the one who holds everything together. You are worthy, not for the weight you carry, but for the softness you've never stopped holding on to, even when the world forgot to hold you back.
It happens quietly, the way you brace yourself before you cry, the way you whisper, I'm sorry, as if your sadness is something shameful. It's not just about the tears. It's about the moment they escape, and you instinctively begin to clean them up. Wipe them fast. Laugh through them. Apologize for being too much, too emotional, too anything that might make someone else uncomfortable. You've been trained gently and over time to treat your pain as an inconvenience. You don't remember exactly when it started. Maybe it was the way someone looked at you the first time you cried in front of them. Maybe it was being told to stop overreacting when your heart was aching. Maybe it was the subtle shift in people's voices when you opened up, that discomfort, that awkwardness, that quick change of topic. Somewhere along the way, you learned that your feelings were only okay in silence, that emotion was only welcome when it was controlled, cleaned up, and manageable. So you held it in. You learned to smile with wet eyes, to turn your pain into jokes, to say, I'm fine with a voice that barely held together, And when it all became too much and something slipped through, a breakdown, a moment of vulnerability, a visible crack, you apologized. Not just with words but with your whole body, your posture, your tone, your silence after. You made yourself smaller, as if your sadness took up too much space. You began to believe it, that showing pain was a kind of failure, that strong people don't break down, that being seen in your grief made you a burden. So you kept quiet, you grieved in private, you fell apart behind closed doors, and even when someone asked if you were okay, you answered in a way that made them feel better, not you. You've become an expert at that, at making your own suffering palatable, but inside the weight hasn't lessened. It just shifted. It lives in your shoulders, in your tired bones, in the way you overthink everything you say after an emotional moment. You worry you made them uncomfortable. You worry you were too much. You replay the scene, dissecting it, punishing yourself for being human. And yet, if someone else cried in front of you, would you think they were weak? Would you see them as a problem to be fixed? Of course not. You'd sit beside them. You'd hold space for them. You'd tell them there's nothing to apologize for. So why can't you give yourself that same permission? It's not your fault. This world teaches us early that emotional control is strength and emotional expression is mess. Especially if you were raised in spaces where sadness was inconvenient, where the grown-ups had no room for your tears, where vulnerability wasn't modeled, only managed. You learned quickly, quiet down, smile, stay light, and so the apology became part of the process. You couldn't just feel, you had to excuse the feeling, you had to soften it for others, and over time even your grief became edited, not because it wasn't real, but because you were afraid of being left for it. And that fear, of being left for feeling too deeply, shaped everything. But you were never too much. You were just trying to be honest in a world that didn't know what to do with your truth. And now maybe you're starting to wonder, what if I stopped apologizing? What if I let the tears fall without shame? What if my breakdown wasn't a sign of weakness, but a signal that I've carried too much, too quietly, for too long? You're not wrong for feeling. You're not broken for cracking open. You're not a burden for needing to be held. You are allowed to unravel. You are allowed to be messy. You are allowed to fall apart in front of the people who say they love you. Because love that cannot hold your sorrow isn't love at all. And when the tears come, when the weight is too much, when your heart feels like it might split, you don't have to say sorry before you say help. You don't have to mask your emotions to be worthy of care. You don't have to shrink yourself for love. You are not something that needs to be managed. You are someone that deserves to be met, fully, softly, and without apology. There have been so many moments when you felt it rise, the emotion, the pressure, the words caught in your throat. It didn't always start with tears. Sometimes it was a pause too long before you spoke, a tightness in your chest, a small shake in your voice, and then came that familiar response, that whispered reflexive, sorry, as if the simple act of feeling something was something that needed forgiveness, as if existing with emotion meant you were crossing a line you didn't even know was drawn. You've said sorry for crying, for being too quiet, for not being able to pretend. You've said it for needing reassurance, for asking twice, for showing disappointment, for needing someone to just stay. You've apologized for your humanity, like it was something you should have hidden better. And every time you did, something inside you folded smaller. Your voice, your confidence, your sense of worth. It was like each apology made the room a little less safe to be real in. You became skilled at self-erasure. You noticed the subtle discomfort in someone's face, and adjusted your tone mid-sentence. You heard the sigh on the other end of the call, and decided your needs weren't that important after all. You edited your emotions before they were ever spoken, and when they slipped through, When they broke past your practiced composure, you scrambled to clean them up. Fast, neat, quiet. But where did that come from? That urge to apologize for the honest parts of you. It didn't start in adulthood. It started younger. Maybe someone told you you were too sensitive. Maybe someone mocked your feelings, or walked away when things got hard. Maybe you were taught, not in words but in looks and silences, that the safest way to be loved was to be easy, light, manageable. So you learned to apologize not just for what you did, but for what you felt. You learned that your sadness made things awkward, that your anger made people pull away, that your need for comfort might make someone leave. You absorbed it all until the apology wasn't just a word, it was a way of being. It was the space between every sentence, the invisible preface to your truth. And even now when you break down, whether it's a sudden wave or a slow unraveling, the first thing you think about isn't relief. It's regret. Regret for letting it show, for making someone see, for not hiding it better. You want to disappear into the floor, not because your feelings are wrong, but because you've been taught that they're too heavy for others to hold. But what if they're not? What if your sadness isn't a burden, but an invitation? What if your tears aren't weakness, but a language of truth? What if the real tragedy isn't that you feel so much, but that you've had to feel it all alone? You've comforted others without asking for anything in return. You've sat through their storms, offered warmth, stayed even when it was hard. And yet when the roles reverse, you feel the need to soften your pain for their comfort. You feel the need to be smaller, even in your most broken moments. That's not balance. That's self-neglect, dressed as strength. It's time to unlearn that, to notice the moments when I'm sorry wants to escape your lips, and to replace it with silence, with breath, with a steadying hand on your own chest. You don't owe anyone an apology for the cracks in your voice, for the truth in your tears, for the silence that comes after the weight has been released. You are not embarrassing for feeling deeply. You are not difficult for needing space to break. You are not dramatic for wanting to be held instead of fixed. And anyone who makes you feel that way has not earned the most tender parts of you. You have spent too long apologizing for being human, for being soft, for being real. But softness is not a weakness, it is a strength in a world that teaches armor. And real love, the kind that stays, the kind that holds, will never flinch at your tears. It will never shrink from your sadness. It will not ask you to apologize for being vulnerable. It will sit beside you and say, "You don't have to hide here, I'm not leaving." Until that love arrives, start saying that to yourself. Be the voice that says, "You're allowed to feel this. You don't owe anyone an apology for it. You are safe with me." Let that become the new rhythm. Not apology, but acceptance. Not shame, but gentleness. You deserve that. You always have. It didn't happen overnight. But eventually the apology became automatic, a reflex. It arrived before the tears had fully formed, before your voice even trembled. It was built into the structure of how you existed, to preface any vulnerability with guilt, to make sure others knew you were aware of your emotional presence, and that you were sorry for it, as if that made it easier for them, as if saying sorry softened the edges of your pain, enough for it to be tolerated. But the apology never made the pain smaller. It only made you smaller. Over time, you began to notice that even in your loneliest, most tender moments, you were still managing other people's comfort. You would break down, but only briefly. You'd cry, but then apologize for it, with a nervous laugh. You'd open up, but with disclaimers. "Sorry, I know this is a lot," or "Sorry, I didn't mean to make things heavy." You kept offering escape routes to the people around you, and too many of them took them. It taught you something, that perhaps if you didn't edit your sadness, people wouldn't stay, that your emotions were something to clean up fast, something to hide before they drew too much attention. And while no one ever said it outright, the message was clear.
Your vulnerability made people uncomfortable, so you made it easier for them. You became a quiet, controlled version of pain, and you convinced yourself that this was strength. But it wasn't strength. It was fear. It was grief. It was your softest voice trying not to be too loud. And now maybe you're tired. Tired of shrinking. Tired of holding it all in. Tired of apologizing for something as natural and necessary as emotion. You want to be able to sit in your sadness without having to say you're sorry for it. You want to break down and not feel like you've failed some unspoken rule about being composed. You want to be loved without having to smile through your tears. Because the truth is, you don't owe anyone that performance. Not the people who claim to love you. Not the ones who say they care. If they can't sit with your sadness, they don't deserve your strength. If they need you to apologize for your feelings, they're not safe enough to see you fully. You were never too much. You were just expressing what hurt. You were never wrong for crying. You were human, and your humanity is not something to apologize for. So what if, next time, the tears come, you let them fall without explanation? What if you stayed in the feeling a little longer, without rushing to say, "I'm fine"? What if you trusted that the right people won't run from your pain, won't treat your emotions like a mess to be swept away? You deserve to be met in your sorrow, to be held without being handled, to be heard without being hurried. And even if you haven't found that space in others yet, you can begin by creating it within yourself. No more whispering sorry every time your heart shows. No more folding yourself up to fit into someone else's comfort zone. You are allowed to be the full range of who you are, even in your rawest moments. Let your emotions rise. Let them speak. Let them teach you who is willing to stay, not just when you're smiling but when you're breaking. Let your breakdowns become sacred. Let them be honest. Let them be free. And when the instinct to apologize rises up, pause, take a breath, place your hand over your chest, and remind yourself this feeling is not wrong. I do not need to be sorry for being alive in all my depth. I am allowed to be seen.
There's a specific kind of silence that follows when you open up. Not the comforting kind, but the kind that makes you question whether you should have said anything at all. You've felt it. After you shared something raw, something that took courage, and the room just shifted. Their eyes moved away. Their words changed tone. The pause stretched just long enough to feel like a warning. And in that space, before anyone even said anything, your mind had already whispered it. You went too far. That was too much. You carried that moment with you for longer than you admitted. It wasn't just that you felt awkward. It was that it confirmed something deeper you had already feared, that your emotions, your honesty, your depth, made people uncomfortable. That being open didn't lead to connection, it led to distance. So you learned to edit yourself, to anticipate what people could handle, to share the parts of you that were safe, familiar, light, and to bury the rest beneath quiet smiles and practiced nods. And the hardest part, you weren't wrong. There were times when you were met with discomfort, when people did back away, when someone said, "That's a lot," or looked at you like your truth was a burden, and that left a mark. Not because you didn't expect it, but because some small part of you had hoped, just once, it would be different, that someone would stay. So now you carry your feelings like fragile glass, careful not to drop them, careful not to let them clink too loudly. You test the temperature of every room. You measure your words like weight on a scale. You present your heart in smaller and smaller pieces, hoping it's finally the right size for someone to hold without flinching. But even that effort exhausts you, and it never quite silences the voice inside that says, maybe you're just too much, too emotional, too intense, too soft, too deep, too aware of things no one else wants to talk about. You felt the eyes roll when you said what you really felt. You've watched someone shift the topic mid-sentence. You've heard the sigh on the other end of the call, when your answer wasn't "I'm good," and so you began to preface everything, "I don't want to overwhelm you," or "Sorry if this is a lot," or "It's okay if you don't have space for this." But why did you have to say that at all? Why did your honesty require a disclaimer? Why did your emotions need to be made easier for others before they could be heard? Maybe you weren't too much. Maybe they were too unprepared to meet you at the depth you live in. Maybe they were never taught how to hold space for someone else's sorrow, so they labeled it as excess. Maybe their own discomfort was dressed up as your fault. And yet you took that blame. You internalized it. You began to believe that if someone pulled away, it must be because you gave them too much of you. That your tenderness was overwhelming. That your vulnerability was a weight they didn't want to carry. And maybe it was. But that doesn't mean it was wrong. You weren't wrong to feel. You weren't wrong to share. You weren't wrong to hope that someone might care enough to stay. You are not too much. You are exactly the right size for the kind of love that knows how to stay when the conversation turns quiet, for the kind of presence that leans in instead of pulling back, for the kind of friendship that doesn't treat your pain as an interruption, but as part of the story. There will always be people who only want the polished version of you, the version who laughs on cue, and never makes them think too hard. But those are not your people. They are passing stops, not safe harbors, and you deserve a harbor, a place to rest your truth without apology. You don't have to keep shrinking to be understood. You don't have to dilute yourself to make others stay. You don't have to fear being real, because someone somewhere is waiting for the exact version of you that you've been told is too much. Not because it's overwhelming, but because it's honest, because it's rare, because it's beautiful, because it's you. You started holding your breath in conversations, not physically, but emotionally, waiting to see if what you said would be accepted, watching their expressions closely, too closely, scanning their reactions for discomfort, boredom, avoidance. You learned to read faces like maps. You became fluent in the language of disinterest, and every time someone looked away, responded with silence, or changed the subject too quickly, the voice inside you whispered again, "See, you said too much. You felt too much. You are too much." And so you adapted. You began to curate your presence. You made yourself lighter in rooms that felt heavy. You shared less, or if you shared, you did it with humor, as if you were protecting them from the weight of your truth. You turned your pain into punchlines, your sadness into metaphors. You learned how to make your grief beautiful, your breakdown poetic, because maybe then it would be easier for others to hear. Maybe then you wouldn't be labeled dramatic. Maybe then they'd stay. But it still stung, didn't it? When someone laughed nervously, instead of listening. When someone called you too intense, or told you to just not think so much. When someone ghosted you after a moment of honesty. It didn't just sting. It rewrote the way you saw yourself. Because you weren't trying to overwhelm anyone. You weren't demanding anything. You were simply being honest. And their reaction made you feel like honesty itself was a threat. You began to walk around your feelings like they were fragile glass in a crowded room, careful not to let them clatter too loudly, careful not to expose them in places where they might be called too deep, too sensitive, too much. You started to apologize not just with words but with behavior, by shrinking, by laughing things off, by pulling away before they could. And yet you kept longing for that one moment when someone wouldn't flinch, when someone would look at you and say, "It's okay, I can handle this, you're not too much for me," because that's what you really needed, wasn't it? Not advice, not solutions, just someone to hold the space without trying to escape it, just someone who saw you fully, and didn't blink. But that moment never came, or maybe it did, but it was so rare that you began to doubt it had ever been real, and the absence of it carved something deep inside you, a hesitancy, a guardedness, a quiet belief that maybe it was safer not to be known, Maybe it was easier to only be loved in parts, the parts that laughed, the parts that comforted, the parts that never asked for anything back. You stopped expecting people to stay when things got real, and so you stopped offering your reality. You showed up in pieces. You let them love a version of you that was manageable, and for a while that worked, until it didn't, because deep down you still ached to be met, fully. You still longed for someone to say, "I want the whole of you, not just the parts that make me comfortable." You wondered if that was unrealistic, if maybe you just feel more than others do, if maybe your wiring is different, heavier, sharper, more sensitive to what others brush off. But feeling deeply is not a flaw, it is not a weakness, it is not a disqualifier for love. It is in fact the very thing that makes you capable of loving the way you do, with detail, with memory, with presence, with depth. You are not imagining it. People have pulled back, people have misunderstood you, people have called you too much because they could not recognize their own limitations. But that does not mean you have to make yourself smaller, that does not mean your depth must be diluted. The truth is your capacity to feel is a kind of courage, a rare and quiet bravery in a world that often prefers silence over honesty. And yes, it may have cost you, but it has also made you someone worth finding, worth knowing, worth staying for. You are not asking for too much. You are asking for what is true, what is kind, what is sacred. You are asking to be met where you are, not halfway, not with conditions, but with presence. You are asking to be loved the way you love. And that is not too much. That is the beginning of everything. There's a loneliness that comes from being the one who feels too deeply, in a world that rarely slows down to feel at all. You've spent so much of your life navigating that ache, the one that whispers you're somehow different, that you love too hard, think too long, ask for too much. You've tried to quiet it, to train yourself to be easier, quieter, less layered. You've tried to love in a way that doesn't disrupt the comfort of those who don't want to feel as deeply as you do. But all it's ever done is disconnect you from the very parts of yourself that were never wrong to begin with. Because the truth is, you didn't imagine that it was too much. People did walk away when you showed them the whole of who you were. They did stop calling. They did flinch at your honesty. You weren't making it up. And that's what hurt the most. That even when you showed up with softness and care, even when your vulnerability was a quiet offering and not a demand, even then it wasn't always received, and it made you question the value of your own heart. You began to treat your emotions like messes you had to clean up before anyone saw them. You tried to make your sadness polite, your anxiety quiet, your loneliness efficient. You didn't want to be a burden. You didn't want to inconvenience anyone, so you started tidying yourself up before every interaction. You filtered your feelings, rehearsed your words, kept things light, and people thanked you for being so easy to talk to, not realizing that your ease came at the cost of your truth. But the cost didn't stay hidden. It showed up in how exhausted you felt after simple conversations. It showed up in the tightness in your chest when you laughed at jokes that hurt a little. It showed up in the way you replayed every message you sent, wondering if maybe this was the one where you finally said too much. It showed up in your silence, in your slow, quiet retreat from people who never asked why you were suddenly less present. You began to internalize it all. Maybe it's me, you thought. Maybe I'm just not built for closeness. Maybe I'm too complex. Maybe I should just keep it all to myself. And so you did. You learned to be okay with being unseen. You mastered the art of being low maintenance. You took pride in being self-sufficient, in needing nothing, even though what you craved most was to be held, to be mirrored, to be told, "You're not too much. I'm still here." You dreamed of a connection where you didn't have to hide the depth of your feeling, where you could say what you really meant and not be met with distance, where silence didn't follow your vulnerability, where you weren't left wondering whether your truth had pushed someone away. That connection is rare. Yes, but it is real, and it begins with you.
with the quiet radical decision to stop apologizing for your depth, to stop shrinking every time someone calls you too intense or too emotional or too complicated. You are not too much. You are just more than they were ready to hold, and it is not your job to become less so they can stay. Let them go. Let every person who couldn't sit with the fullness of you find something easier. Let them choose simplicity over honesty. Let them miss out, because you, in all your feeling, in all your thinking, in all your heart, were never the problem. You were the invitation to love deeper, to speak truer, to know someone beyond the surface. You don't need to be palatable to be loved. You don't need to be quiet to be worthy. You don't need to be smaller to be safe. What you need is to be met, and that begins when you stop editing your soul to make room for people who never offered you space in the first place. You are not too much. You are a mirror for what most people are afraid to feel, and one day someone will see that not as a warning, but as a light, and they will stay, not because you made it easy, but because you made it real.
There's a kind of tired that sleep doesn't fix, a kind of exhaustion that doesn't live in your muscles but in your heart. And even when you felt that weight pressing down on you, when your body was worn and your mind frayed from too many days of carrying things silently, you still offered help, still answered the call, still asked others if they were okay even when you weren't. You moved through the day holding everyone else's needs above your own, as if your worth was tied to your ability to keep showing up, no matter what it cost you. You learnt early how to put others first. Maybe it came from being the one in the family who had it together. Maybe it was born in the friendships where your silence was more welcome than your sorrow. Maybe you were taught that love looks like self-sacrifice, that the highest form of goodness is to give without limit. So you did. You became dependable, constant, the one people knew they could turn to when their worlds were falling apart, even when yours was too. You never told anyone how tired you were, how your smile had started to feel like a performance, how the kindness you gave so freely sometimes came from a well that was dangerously close to empty. You didn't want anyone to worry. You didn't want to make things about you. So you kept offering, kept responding, kept absorbing the heaviness around you like it was your role, and maybe in some way you believed it was, and the world rewarded you for it. People called you strong, selfless, reliable. They thanked you for always being there, but they never asked what it was costing you. They never stopped to wonder if the hands that helped everyone else were shaking quietly when no one was looking. They never looked beneath the calm in your voice, or the steadiness in your support. And after a while, neither did you. You normalized your depletion, told yourself that being tired was just part of being a good person, that needing space was selfish, that prioritizing your energy meant letting someone down. So you stopped saying no, even when you needed rest, even when your body was begging for it, even when your mind was already stretched thin and your soul felt quiet from too much giving. It wasn't that you didn't want to help, it's that somewhere along the way helping became a way of proving you were enough, of staying connected, of keeping love nearby. You feared what would happen if you stopped showing up. If you started saying, "I can't right now." You were afraid people would leave, afraid that your value would slip away the moment you stopped making yourself useful. So you kept going, answering the messages, holding space, offering the right words, the calming presence, the soft understanding, even when you had none left for yourself, and you were praised for it. Again and again, for your generosity, for your patience, for your ability to always be the one who showed up. But beneath the praise was a growing ache, a longing, a question you didn't know how to ask. When will someone show up for me like this? You didn't want pity. You didn't want applause. You just wanted someone to notice, to reach out first, to ask how you were and not move on until they got the real answer. to say you always help everyone else, but how can I help you today? And more than anything, you wanted to be able to answer honestly, without guilt, without fear, without feeling like your vulnerability was a burden instead of a bridge, because you were tired. Not just physically, but emotionally, spiritually, tired of carrying, of smiling, of constantly being the strong one, tired of waiting for someone to see behind the curtain you kept so carefully in place, tired of showing up full when you felt so empty, and still you helped. Still you said yes. Still you offered comfort, even when you were longing for it yourself, because that's who you are, because you've always known what it feels like to not be helped, and you never wanted anyone else to feel that way. But maybe now it's time to ask something different. Not just who needs you, but who returns to you. Not just who reaches out, but who stays. Not just who praises your kindness, but who protects your energy, because you are not just a helper, you are a human being, and you deserve rest. You deserve care. You deserve love that doesn't only take but also gives. You became the quiet constant, the one they always knew would say yes, the one who answered texts at midnight, the one who dropped everything for the people you cared about. It didn't matter if you were already overwhelmed, if your day was falling apart, if you had barely held yourself together, you still found a way to be there, to offer presence, to offer calm. And the truth is, most of them never even realized how tired you were while you did it. You made it look effortless, even when it wasn't. You didn't cry on the phone. You didn't ask for anything in return. You asked questions about them, let them talk, held their chaos while yours hummed quietly beneath your skin. You knew exactly what to say to soothe someone else's storm, even when you were standing in your own. But when it was over, when the call ended, or the message was sent, or the favor was done, you sat in the silence of your own exhaustion, not just from the task, but from the invisible work of holding space you so rarely received. You gave so much, and no one saw the emotional labor behind your kindness. No one asked what it took from you to keep being the one who showed up, and still you did. Again and again. Because love for you was service. It was consistency. It was saying, I'm here, even when no one had said that to you in a long time. You didn't want recognition. Not exactly, but you wanted someone to notice. Someone to say, you've been doing a lot. How are you holding up? Not as a formality, not as a polite question, but as a real tender inquiry that stayed and listened. That kind of care rarely came, and when it did, it felt like a miracle. You clung to those rare moments, those small sacred pauses where someone saw past your steadiness and into your weariness. But most of the time, your exhaustion went unseen. You had trained people so well to believe in your resilience that they stopped looking for cracks. And you started to believe that maybe cracks weren't allowed. That maybe strength meant pushing through, showing up, giving more, always more. So when your body cried out, when your chest tightened, when the world felt too loud, you told yourself to breathe, to calm down, to keep going. You told yourself, they need you, and somehow that always felt more important than the fact that you needed someone too. But help is not meant to be a one-way street. Love is not meant to be an exchange where you give endlessly and receive only in moments of collapse. You shouldn't have to fall apart to be cared for. You shouldn't have to hide your exhaustion to be loved. There were so many times you wanted to say no. So many days when your soul whispered, please rest, please stop. But the thought of disappointing someone felt worse than the ache in your bones. The guilt was louder than your fatigue. And so you pushed through, smiling gently, speaking softly, offering support with hands that were already trembling. And now maybe you're feeling the cost of it. The way your energy has thinned, the way your joy has dulled,
The way your own needs have slipped so far down the list that you no longer know what they even are. You've poured so much into others that your own cup feels dry, not just today, but every day, and no one refills it unless you ask. But asking, that's the hardest part of all, because the world taught you that asking was weakness, that needing help made you a burden, that exhaustion was something to be hidden, not honored, and so you kept going, kept proving that you could do it all, until now. Now you're learning to pause, to listen to the quiet parts of you that are asking for care, to notice the resentment that creeps in, not because you don't love helping, but because no one helps you. You're learning to say, I can't right now, without shame. You're learning to set boundaries, not out of anger, but out of protection, of self-respect, of healing. You are not selfish for needing time. You are not wrong for wanting rest. You are not weak for choosing yourself, even if it disappoints someone else. You've been strong in the ways that no one saw. Now be soft in the ways that only you can give yourself. You are allowed to say, not this time, and the people who truly love you will understand, and the ones who don't, let them go. You don't need to earn your worth through exhaustion anymore. You never did. There is a kind of heartbreak that doesn't come from betrayal, or absence, or harsh words, but from the slow realization that the love you give is not always the love you receive, that the way you show up for others, fully, even when you're falling apart, is not the way they show up for you. You don't expect people to be perfect. You don't expect them to fix you, but you had hoped, quietly, deeply, that maybe someone would notice when you needed rest, without you having to explain it, that maybe someone would say, you've done enough, let me carry it for a while. But that moment rarely came. You were always the one who noticed first, who sensed the shift in someone's voice, who picked up on the pause between their sentences. You didn't wait to be asked. You offered, not because you had the energy, but because you had the heart. You knew what it felt like to be invisible in your struggle, and you never wanted anyone else to feel that way. So you helped, even when you were tired, even when your mind was heavy, and your body begged you to stop. You reassured people with a calmness that you didn't feel inside. You gave advice you couldn't even apply to yourself. You were present, fully, for others in ways no one had ever been for you, and for a while that made you proud, but eventually it made you lonely, because when it was your turn to fall apart, there was no line of people asking how they could help. There were no late-night messages checking in. No one brought you softness, without you having to earn it first. You were surrounded by people who loved the version of you that had energy to give, but didn't know what to do with the version of you that needed to receive. And maybe you tried to explain it. Once, maybe you said, I'm really tired, or I feel like no one sees me right now, and the response didn't land the way you needed. They offered quick solutions, or silence, or worse, they turned it around, made it about them, reminded you of how much you were loved without ever asking what you needed, and that moment confirmed what you feared, that your value was tied to your usefulness, that your exhaustion was too inconvenient to be held. So you stopped asking, you stopped waiting, you taught yourself how to recover quietly, how to recharge in solitude, how to cry in the bathroom, and then wash your face and go back out like nothing happened. You became a master of composure, not because you didn't feel deeply, but because you didn't feel safe enough to be unguarded. But even now, some part of you still longs for ease, for presence, for someone to read between the lines the way you always do, for someone to say, you don't have to keep proving your strength. I see how much you're holding, and you don't have to hold it alone. You've learned how to survive without that, but surviving isn't the same as being held, and being held is something you deserve, not when you've hit your breaking point, not when you've collapsed, but even now, even in the in-between, even when you look okay on the outside, and no one would guess how exhausted your soul really feels. You're learning now that help doesn't always have to be earned, that rest is not a reward for your service, it's a right, that your capacity to care for others doesn't mean you should be the one who always carries the most. You're learning that your boundaries are not walls, but bridges, ways to keep love sustainable, not performative. And maybe it still feels unnatural, saying no, putting the phone down, letting someone else carry the conversation, letting the silence sit without rushing to fill it with comfort. But you're practicing, you're giving yourself what no one else did, permission to rest, to need, to receive, to stop feeling guilty for being human. You are not just the helper, you are not just the giver, you are not just the safe space for everyone else. You are a person, soft, tired, worthy, and if no one else tells you this, let this be the moment. You don't have to carry it all, not anymore, not alone,